Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The once proud fairy kingdom stood on the brink of collapse. It had been centuries since its last golden age, when its cities were vibrant with life, and its forests sang with the voices of the fairies who roamed free and wild under the stars. But time had not been kind to the kingdom, and now, the trees that once sheltered them from invaders stood twisted and gnarled, the cities overgrown and abandoned. What remained of the once united fairy clans now existed in small, isolated communities, each with their own grievances and suspicions of the others. It was within this fractured world that a decision was made by the Fairy Council, an ancient body of advisors and leaders from various factions that would forever alter the course of their history. For the first time in centuries, they decided to hold an election. The purpose? To choose a new president for the kingdom, someone who could restore its former glory and guide the fairies through the uncertainty that had plagued them for too long. The stakes were high. The kingdom's very survival depended on the outcome. The candidates were as varied as the kingdom itself. The first was Eldern, the ancient and wise Styrian king, whose connection to the land and its natural order had made him a revered figure among the tree folk. He had ruled for longer than most fairies had been alive, and his wisdom was unmatched, though many questioned whether his age had left him too slow and too tied to tradition to lead them into the future. The second candidate was Alyssa, a young and ambitious sorceress. She was the face of the modern fairy world, a rising star among the magical elite. Her vision for the kingdom involved a radical shift toward progress, the use of advanced magic to rebuild their cities, and a complete restructuring of their society. To many of the younger fairies, she represented hope. But to the older generation, her ideas bordered on recklessness, and her power was feared almost as much as it was admired. Finally, there was Shade, a shadow fairy known for his cunning and manipulation. Unlike the other two candidates, Shade did not appear openly on the campaign trail, instead choosing to work from the shadows literally and figuratively. His methods were subtle, his presence more felt than seen. His motives, too, were a mystery, but his promises of a kingdom ruled by strength and power drew those who believed that only a strong hand could restore the kingdom's fractured state. The election, meant to unite, did the opposite. Almost immediately, the campaign turned ugly. Factions aligned themselves with their chosen candidates, and distrust simmered between the races. The tree folk supported Eldern almost unanimously, while the younger fairies and magic users rallied behind Alyssa. Shade's supporters were harder to identify, as he had carefully cultivated a network of spies, informants, and those who preferred to keep their allegiances secret. Tensions escalated as the candidates began their campaigns in earnest. Eldern's speeches were full of poetic reverence for the old ways. He spoke of harmony with nature, of the balance that once existed between the kingdom's people and the land they called home. In the deep, ancient forests where the tree folk made their homes, his words were met with thunderous applause. But outside of these enclaves, his message was received with skepticism. The younger fairies, in particular, saw his call for a return to the old ways as nothing more than a fantasy. The world had changed, they said. The kingdom needed to change with it. Alyssa, on the other hand, was all fire and passion. Her speeches brimmed with energy, and her message of progress and renewal struck a chord with the kingdom's younger population. She promised a new age of magic, where the ruins of their once great cities would be rebuilt with advanced sorcery, and where the kingdom would finally take its place as a beacon of magical prowess across the realms. She spoke of innovation, of bold new ideas that would leave the old ways behind and carve a path toward a future full of promise. But her detractors were vocal as well. The older generation, particularly those among the tree folk and the more traditional fairies, whispered of the dangers of her magic. They said that magic, in the hands of someone as ambitious as Alyssa, was a double-edged sword. It could rebuild their cities, but it could also destroy them. Power like hers was seductive, and once unleashed, there would be no way to control it. In contrast to the public campaigns of Eldern and Alyssa, Shade was a shadowy presence, felt but rarely seen. His methods were not those of grand speeches or public rallies. Instead, he relied on whispers in the dark, secret meetings held in the corners of taverns, and backroom deals made in the dead of night. His message was clear to those who sought him out: that power should not be flaunted, but wielded in silence. Strength lay in the unseen, in the ability to manipulate events without drawing attention to oneself, and if the kingdom were to survive, it would need a ruler who understood that power was a game to be played in the shadows, not on the public stage. His followers were the outcasts, the spies, the thieves, and the disenfranchised, and those who had no place in the bright, shining world that Alyssa promised, nor in the nostalgic vision of Eldern. For them, Shade represented a future where they could thrive, where they could rise from the shadows and take their place as the true rulers of the kingdom. As the election neared, the tension between the factions began to boil over. Rumors of sabotage spread like wildfire. Allegations that Alyssa's supporters had used dark magic to interfere with Eldern's campaign surfaced, though there was little proof to support the claims. In retaliation, several of Alyssa's key supporters were found dead under mysterious circumstances, their bodies discovered in the deep woods near the tree folk's strongholds. Accusations flew in all directions, with each faction blaming the other for the increasing violence. In truth, no one knew who was responsible for the bloodshed. It could have been any of the Aima or none. But one thing was clear: the kingdom was on the brink of civil war. The election, meant to unite them, had only driven them further apart. Behind the scenes, Shade worked tirelessly to ensure that the chaos continued to spread. It was all part of his plan. He had long ago realized that the kingdom could not be ruled by force alone. No, the true path to power lay in the ability to manipulate others, to sow distrust and division, to make others do his bidding without ever realizing they were playing into his hands. But Shade's ambitions went even deeper than the presidency. For years, he had been quietly gathering information on an ancient dark force, a malevolent entity that had once been sealed away deep beneath the kingdom, long before the fairies had ever risen to power. It was a force of chaos and destruction, a force that fed on fear and hatred, and Shade had every intention of releasing it. His plan was simple: let the election tear the kingdom apart. Let the chaos grow until the dark force was strong enough to break free from its prison. And when it did, Shade would be there, ready to seize control and harness its power for himself. But Alyssa and Eldern, though divided by their visions for the kingdom, were not blind to the growing threat. They had both begun to realize that the election was spiraling out of control, that if something wasn't done soon, the kingdom would fall into ruin. Neither trusted the other, but both knew that the true danger lay not in each other's ambitions, but in the darkness that was creeping ever closer. It was Alyssa who made the first move. She sought out Eldern in the depths of the forest, deep within his ancient grove where the trees themselves seemed to whisper in warning of the coming storm. It was a risk, she knew, to approach him directly. Eldern's distrust of her magic was well known, and his followers were fiercely protective of their king. But the situation had become too dire to let old grudges stand in the way of what had to be done. When Alyssa arrived at Eldern's grove, the ancient Radiant King stood tall among the trees, his bark-covered form towering over her like the trees he commanded. His deep, rumbling voice carried the weight of centuries as he spoke. "You come here, sorceress, with your talk of progress and magic. Why should I trust you now, when your kind has always sought to bend nature to your will?" Alyssa met his gaze without flinching. "Because we're running out of time. Whatever's happening in the kingdom, it's not just about us. There's something darker at work here. Shade is planning something that goes beyond the election." For a long moment, Eldern was silent, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I felt it, too." The trees whisper of a great darkness stirring in the depths of the earth. "But what do you propose, sorceress?" "Our people are divided, and trust is in short supply," Alyssa took a deep breath. We need to stop Shade together. And so, an unlikely alliance was born. Eldrin's decision to ally with Alyssa was not taken lightly, but the sense of impending doom weighed heavily on his ancient form. His connection to the deep roots of the forest, to the very earth itself, had grown increasingly restless in recent weeks. The whispers of the trees had become erratic, filled with warnings of a darkness that was awakening beneath the kingdom. Alyssa's arrival most confirmed what he had feared for some time. Shade's ambitions reached far beyond the presidency. And now, the kingdom's future rested on an uneasy partnership. They wasted no time. Alyssa and Eldrin moved swiftly through the woods, their goal clear: confront Shade before he could unleash whatever dark power he had discovered. As they traveled, Alyssa used her magic to communicate with her allies, sending pulses of energy through the magical ley lines that crisscrossed the kingdom. Her supporters were on high alert, and though tensions still simmered between the various factions, the urgency of the threat had, at least temporarily, united them. They knew what was at stake. Shade had to be stopped. They approached the outskirts of a small, forgotten village that lay on the kingdom's edge, deep in the shadow of the ancient mountains. This was where Shade had been hiding, using the village's remote location to conduct his dark experiments. The air around them seemed thick with foreboding, and even the trees grew sparse, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky as if in warning. Alyssa's hand tightened around the hilt of the staff she carried, the magical energy within it crackling with anticipation. Eldrin, silent but resolute, moved with the grace of a creature who had lived for millennia, his massive frame blending seamlessly with the natural world around him. As they reached the village, they were met by a handful of Shade's followers, as shadowy figures with cloaks that seemed to blend into the darkness itself. They moved silently, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light, as if they had already been touched by the dark power Shade sought to release. Alyssa stepped forward, raising her staff. The air around her hummed with energy, and with a swift motion, she sent a pulse of light toward the shadowy figures. They recoiled, hissing like serpents as the light tore through their defenses, dissolving them into nothingness. His influence runs deep, Eldrin said, his voice low, almost mournful. These were once fairies, corrupted by his lies. Alyssa nodded grimly. And they won't be the last if we don't stop him. Together, they pushed forward, their steps growing heavier as they neared the heart of the village. It was here, in the central square, that they finally found Shade. He stood before a massive stone altar, his hands raised to the sky as dark energy swirled around him. The air was thick with a stench of sulfur and decay, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if the earth itself was responding to the dark magic Shade had summoned. Shade, Alyssa's voice rang out, cutting through the thick air like a blade. This ends now. Shade lowered his hands slowly, turning to face them with a smile that sent chills down Alyssa's spine. His eyes, once a deep violet, were now a sickly green, glowing with the malevolent energy he had been channeling. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched thin over his bones, as if the dark magic had already begun to consume him. But despite his appearance, there was a terrible strength in his voice when he spoke. "You're too late," he said, his voice a low hiss. "The darkness is already awake." Alyssa felt the earth tremble beneath her feet, and she glanced at Eldrin. The ancient Turian king's face was grim, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he extended his roots deep into the ground, trying to push back against the dark force that was rising. But even his immense power seemed to struggle against it. "I can feel it," Eldrin muttered, his voice strained. "It's trying to break free." Shade's laughter echoed through the village, a sound that made Alyssa's blood run cold. "You think you can stop what's coming? The kingdom is already mine. When this force rises, there will be nothing left of your precious fairy world. Only shadows." Alyssa's grip tightened on her staff. "We'll see about that." She launched herself forward, her staff glowing with a brilliant light as she cast a spell meant to shatter the dark barrier Shade had created around the altar. The light collided with the barrier in a flash of energy, and for a moment, It seemed as if it might break through. But then the barrier held, the dark energy swirling around it like a living thing, feeding off Alice's magic and growing stronger. Shade's smile widened. "You still don't understand, do you? This is no ordinary power. This is the force of chaos itself. You cannot control it." But Alice wasn't finished. She could feel the magic building inside her, a well of energy that went deeper than she had ever imagined. With a roar, she summoned everything she had, pouring her magic into a single, devastating blast. The ground beneath them shook violently as the light collided with Shade's barrier once again, this time shattering it with a sound like breaking glass. Shade's eyes widened in surprise, but before he could react, Alyssa was upon him. She swung her staff in a wide arc, sending a wave of light crashing into him. Shade was thrown backward, his body slamming into the stone altar with a sickening crack. For a moment, there was silence. The dark energy that had swirled around the altar began to dissipate, the air growing still and quiet. Alyssa stood, breathing heavily, her body trembling with the effort it had taken to break through Shade's defenses. But then, to her horror, Shade began to laugh again. It was a weak, broken sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. "You think you've won?" he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Alyssa's heart sank as she realized what he meant. The dark force wasn't gone. It was still there, buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for its moment to rise. And then the ground exploded. A massive fissure tore through the center of the village, splitting the earth wide open as a wave of dark energy surged upward. Alyssa was thrown backward, her body slamming into the ground as the force of the explosion knocked the wind from her lungs. She struggled to her feet, her vision swimming as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The dark force had awakened. From the depths of the fissure, a towering figure began to rise. It was unlike anything Alyssa had ever seen, an entity made of shadow and flame, its form shifting and writhing as it clawed its way out of the earth. Its eyes burned with a terrible, malevolent light, and its voice, when it spoke, was the sound of 1,000 souls screaming in unison. "Ya broken bar, ma broken bar chaos." Alyssa's blood turned to ice as the full weight of what they were facing settled over her. This was no mere spirit or demon. This was the embodiment of chaos itself, a force of destruction that had been sealed away for millennia, and now it was free. Beside her, Eldrin groaned, his massive form barely able to stand under the weight of the dark energy that now filled the air. "We cannot defeat this," he said, his voice filled with despair. "Not alone." But Alyssa wasn't ready to give up. She looked at Eldrin, her eyes blazing with determination. "We don't have to defeat it," she said. "We just have to seal it away again." Eldrin looked at her, his expression grim. "That will take more power than even the two of us combined possess." Alyssa nodded, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan. She knew that Eldrin was right, that there was no way they could defeat chaos itself. But there was one thing they could do. If they could find a way to channel the energy of the kingdom's ley line as the magical veins that ran beneath the land, they might be able to seal the dark force away, just as it had been sealed centuries before. But it would require a sacrifice. She met Eldrin's gaze, and in that moment, they both knew what had to be done. Without a word, Eldrin stepped forward, his massive roots sinking deep into the ground as he began to draw upon the energy of the earth. His bark-covered skin glowed with a faint, golden light as the ley lines responded to his call, the power of the land flowing into him. Alyssa joined him, her own magic flaring to life as she reached out to the ley lines, channeling their energy into a single, focused beam. Together, they began to weave a spell, one that would bind the dark force back into the earth, where it could no longer harm the kingdom. But it came at a cost. As the spell grew in strength, Eldrin's body began to crack, his ancient form unable to contain the immense power he was channeling. He let out a low groan, his voice filled with pain, but he did not stop. He knew that this was the only way. Alyssa, too, felt the strain, her body trembling as the magic surged through her. But she pressed on, her eyes fixed on the towering figure of chaos as it writhed and screamed in fury. Finally, with one last surge of power, the spell was complete. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and the dark force let out a final, deafening roar as it was pulled back into the earth, the fissure sealing itself behind it. And then, all was silent. Alyssa collapsed to the ground, her body shaking with exhaustion. She looked around, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had just done. The village was in ruins, the dark force sealed away once more, but at a terrible cost. Eldon was gone. The ancient king had given his life to save the kingdom, his body reduced to nothing more than a pile of ash and splintered wood. Alyssa felt a tear slip down her cheek as she knelt beside the remnants of her fallen ally. The kingdom had been saved, but it would never be the same. When Alyssa returned to the capital, the election was over. Shade had disappeared, his fate unknown, and with Eldon's sacrifice, the people looked to Alyssa for leadership. She was elected as the new president, though the title felt hollow in the wake of everything that had happened. As she stood before the assembled fairies, addressing them for the first time as their leader, Alyssa vowed to honor Eldon's memory. The kingdom would be rebuilt, not just with magic, but with respect for the ancient ways, for the balance between progress and tradition. The fairy kingdom had a long road ahead, but for the first time in centuries, there was hope, and though the shadows still lingered at the edges of the kingdom, Alyssa knew that as long as they stood united, they could face whatever darkness lay ahead.